Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Richard Frank. I am a lecturer here in the School of Politics and International Relations at the ANU, and I'd like to take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about a recent project that I've been working on and how I came up with it and how I developed the research design I did. So let's get started. This paper is one I've been working on for a while, but one in which I'm really excited about, and hopefully you'll kind of see why I'm excited about it and how I developed the research design that I did. And I think it typifies a lot of the processes that we see in the day-to-day work of political scientists and social scientists, science in general. It's trial and error. And when you try to learn how to do methods, and when it was described to me, I always assumed it was a rather clear cut and linear process as it was laid out in class. But in experience, after doing this for over a decade now, it is a lot of trial and error with emphasis on the error. And I think what's really important when you try to think about how you put together a research paper is be transparent about the assumptions you're making, the research question you're asking, and the what you would think would be a good research design, but then leave it open for checking to make sure that you didn't make any obvious mistakes. So the paper that I would like to spend a little time talking about now is this paper that I have forthcoming at International Interactions describing a data set on human trafficking indicators that I've put together. And it is motivated by a real kind of basic research question, which is what is driving human trafficking? It is an issue area that's received a lot of attention in the last 15 or 20 years, but research has come out in the last couple of years that surveyed the literature on human trafficking that suggests that well over two-thirds of all the articles that have been written about human trafficking don't really analyze data or even a specific case about what's leading to it. Often it's on what the effects are. And so my question for this paper is what's driving human trafficking flows. And there really isn't any data out there that has good comparative analysis on what's driving human trafficking. Some people have done some research on some of the major causes using other data sets from the United Nations or from the U.S. Department of State. But I thought, okay, I really want to take a snapshot of what the literature suggests. What can we actually get now from data that I might put together? So me and a whole lot of research assistants looked at different potential sources for trafficking data and found that the U.S. Department of State has these annual reports ever since 2001 on human trafficking around the world. And in graduate school, one of the academics at my graduate school was David Sincredelli, and he really was at the forefront of human trafficking, human rights quantitative data analysis, and move that literature forward, the general study of repression and human rights cross-nationally. And I thought, oh, hey, maybe the Department of State's new reports on human trafficking could also be a potential data source that would enable me to try to gather information to answer that research question, which is what's driving human trafficking flows. So we read through these reports that have been going on from 2001 to 2021 now. The reports have changed a lot over time. There's a lot more information in them. And what we were able to tease out of it was 7 different types of trafficking flows, whether countries are source, transit, or destination hubs for trafficking, as well as there's trafficking within countries. And then we also gathered a whole bunch of information about government's policies. There have been some research that suggested that government's efforts at trying to prevent trafficking, help provide services to trafficking victims, and prosecute human traffickers were really kind of aggregate indicators of it, and I wanted to get at more disaggregated indicators to figure out whether developing better laws would work, or actually prosecuting the laws that are on the books, or efforts of trying to protect victims. What was the most effective? But lots of questions out there that you can pursue. My efforts was to start simply with what's driving human trafficking flows, and then move on to other questions in future work. So gathered the data cross-nationally up to 177 countries from 2001 and 2021, and I was transparent in gathering the data to give instructions to our coders, as well as how to analyze the data, developed a code book, and then wrote this paper to describe the data and give an example of how you could use it to be able to answer that question: what drives human trafficking flows? This is part of a larger book project, but with this data paper, I wanted to give an example of what you could do. And so I started with trying to build on previous research. In social science, it's often important to try to map out what the literature has already done on a field, and then try to see where you contribute to it, where you can find that gap. And I think for me, the gap was developing new data to be able to answer broad cross-national questions like what drives trafficking flows. So I built on existing work by another academic that brought together 70 different factors that the case study literature or policymakers have come out that said could affect being a trafficking destination. And I used my new data to for overall trafficking flows, as well as narrowed to forced labor and sexual exploitation, to see whether those factors would also apply using much different data and more disaggregated data. And what I found was that if you can get more detail on the outcome that you care about, you can actually confirm a lot of the existing findings, like with GDP, that wealthier states should be at a lower risk of being a source for trafficking, but that could be a draw for a trafficking destination. You can see across the different types of trafficking that there is this established relationship. So building on that previous work, I ran a whole bunch of different regressions using every possible combination of variables, and the distribution of that variable across the different models were all in the same direction. You could have more confidence that there really is a relationship, because again, it's about trial and error, whether you can prove yourself wrong, and if you try to and you can't, then maybe you could actually have something that you can believe in and that you can build on. One critique of this, and this came out both from the review process after you actually show your research to other people, you get really useful feedback, as well as my reading of the literature on general human trafficking flows that I mentioned earlier, was that there's a risk that standards have changed, that either people are getting better at capturing this hidden phenomenon like human trafficking, so more people are more likely to get help, and that could be what's driving what we see as an increase in trafficking flows, or that we're better able at getting information. There's more organizations that are collecting information about trafficking flows, and there's been efforts at international standards for governments to be able to gather information about trafficking. And so one of the worries in trying to prove myself wrong, that is whether my data are representative over time. And so I ran a relatively new method in political science called item response theory models, basically trying to capture that latent amount of trafficking that might be harder to measure because it's an illegal outcome that people want to try to hide. So with other forms of crime as well, things that are harder to measure, you try to get a whole bunch of measures from different sources, including my measures, throw them all together and use this kind of method to try to get at the underlying latent probability of having trafficking. And what I found was that there really hadn't been any systematic change in the standards or the amount of information provided over time. And that suggested that we can answer that question of what drives human trafficking flows using these data from a whole bunch of different countries over a whole bunch of different years, to be able to get at better structural measures of what countries look like, and their capacity to deal with these kind of challenges, as well as other more dynamic, quickly changing phenomenon that could make some areas at a higher risk of having trafficking. So for me, answering that question, what drives trafficking flows, some of it was building on the established literature, some was what I want to add in future papers now that I have this resource to be able to use, and also a normative effort to try to make the world a better place. That by understanding some normatively quite difficult to study topics, you can help develop policies and figure out what's driving these trafficking flows to be able to prevent it. And I've looked at this like in another recent paper with a co-author on freedom of foreign movement. In Australia, we've not had really that free of movement outside the country for a while now. And in that other paper, we're looking at other questions, whether government's policies to make it harder for people to leave the country or come into it can help protect vulnerable populations from being moved into the country to be exploited, or whether it can be replaced by domestic populations. So you can use these kind of sources and use other factors that might drive it to help create better answers to that motivating research question, which is what drives trafficking flows. So hopefully that is a brief overview of my research design for a recent project, how I developed the question, how I tried to fill a gap, and the different methods that I used to try to answer the question. And I think for me, I'm always trying to push myself and learn things that I don't know. So for the two main methods for this paper, I hadn't really had that much experience with extreme bounds analysis, though using tons of regressions to look at every possible combination of factors, and dynamic item response theory models, which is a mouthful, new methods of trying to look at the latent probability of trafficking. So for research design, I would encourage you to try to think about big questions, ones that can be important not just for academic theory but in policymaking, and to try to use established as well as new tools to always try to learn something, but then also trying to keep up to date with a whole variety of ways of answering the question. And if you can kind of, through that trial and error process, come up with results that you can defend or be able to anticipate the questions from a variety of sources, then maybe you've got something. So thank you for your time. It's an exciting time to be studying political science and international relations and to be developing all these new methods. So thank you, good luck, and I hope the rest of your lockdown goes well.